In our Torah reading for this Sabbath, we read of the death of the matriarch of our faith, Sarah. And in our discussion, we will explore the eternal truths associated with this sad but important story. And we will touch upon the themes of loving our wives, being a sojourner in this world, burial versus cremation when caring for a deceased loved one, as well as we'll examine many of the historic and cultural elements that are attached to this beautiful reading. Shalom and welcome. And Shabbat Shalom, fellow saints of the Most High. Welcome to the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. I'm Rod Thomas, and I want to thank you for fellowshipping with me here on this blessed day of rest. For it is here that we gather every Shabbat to delve into Jehovah's eternal words of life, his instructions in righteousness, which is our constitution and the foundation for our covenant relationship with the Creator of the universe. And as always, it is our hope, trust, and prayer that this installment of the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections finds you, your families, and fellowships well and blessed. Glory, honor, and praise to our Elohim, and I thank him. I thank him for you, not only being here with me today, but also for your continued support of this ministry. For you are the reason I show up here every Shabbat, and I love showing up here. So may Yah bless you and keep you, and his face shine upon you. We got a big, believe it or not, reading discussion here today, basically every week. So let's open with prayer and get right into it. Father, thank you for this week. Your keeping, your guiding, your blessing, your protecting, your provision, all these things that you have lavished upon us. And now we have this Shabbat, a day of rest that you have commanded us. Well, you have also gifted us, Father, and you've told us to keep this day holy. And so, Father, we come with open hearts, pliable, malleable hearts, open minds to receive your eternal truths on this set-apart day. And we ask your blessings over each and every home represented here. Bless this time together. Keep, guide, and deliver as you always do. Watch over our little ones. Bless their hearts. Bless them. Keep them safe from the evils of this world. We love you, Father, and give you praise. Hallelujah. Well, this is Lessons Learned from the Death of Sarah. Lessons Learned from the Death of Sarah. And it is the 20th reading in our 3-year Torah reading cycle. And it is found in Bereshit, or Genesis, chapter 23, verses 1 through 23. And as in our previous readings, I will be referencing or reading from the Robert Alter translation of Torah entitled The 5 Books of Moses. So I invite you to follow along with whatever translation you prefer or you have. And as in previous discussions, I'll read the verse consecutively first and then comment accordingly if there's anything I have to comment or thoughts or reflections to put to those verses. And at the end, I'll summarize my thoughts and reflections on the reading in what I call practical messianic halakha. So let's begin. We're in chapter 23 of Bereshit, or Genesis. And we're going to begin with verse 1. And it reads, "And Sarah's life was 127 years." Bless her life. bless her heart, the years of Sarah's life, 127 years. So what we have here at this point, it can be safely presumed that Abraham was about 137 years old at Sarah's passing, he being 10 years older than Sarah, as referenced in Genesis chapter 17, verse 17. But here, the matriarch of faith, at 127 years, she passes away. Verse 2, and it reads, and Sarah died in Kiriath-arba, which is Hebrew, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn Sarah and to keen for her. Okay, I just messed up a little bit. Let me reread that, because I said Hebrew because my old-aged eyes are in. You ever done that? You ever read something and you just input a word that looks close to it, but when you read it, it doesn't make sense, and you go back and reread it and you go, oh, I inserted a word for that word that's printed there. So I'm going to go back and reread this. And Sarah died in Kiriath-arba, which is Hebron, not Hebrew, Hebron, in the land of Canaan. And Abraham came to mourn Sarah and to keen for her. Now, according to rabbinic thinking, Kiriath-arba is the old or original name for Hebron. And some say the meaning of Kiriath-arba is the city of four. And I'm referencing that from J.H. Hertz's Torah and Haftarah publication. Now, this meaning has a clear meaning attached to it that I find fascinating. But first, here's an interesting translation from the Jerusalem Targum. The Jerusalem Targum is I don't remember, it's a 2nd or 3rd century of the Common Era translation of Torah that adds to it this rabbinic commentary flavor to it. So when you're reading these things, they add to these things the rabbinic thinking of that time. So it adds some insight in many cases that is fascinating, and that causes us to stop, ponder, and then look further or deeper into the situation. And this is the case here. The Jerusalem Targum for this verse 2, reads, and Sarah died in the city of the giants. She died in the city of the giants. Now, Sarah dying aside, looking at this city of the giants, what could that possibly mean? Well, if we look at the book of Joshua, we possibly find our answer. It reads in chapter 14, verse 15, and this is the NLT version. Well, there goes the phone. I should have silenced that. I apologize for overlooking that little preparation before we're pushing the record button. But in chapter 14 of Joshua, verse 15, the NLT translation, it reads, previously, Hebron had been called Kiriath-arba. It had been named after Arba, a great hero of the descendants of Anak. And the land had rest from war. So it turns out, beloved, that Arba may have been a giant, otherwise known as a Nephilim. And we find in the book of Joshua that Arba was Anak's daddy. And this is found in reference Joshua chapter 15, verse 13. And it was Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, who drove out, and some sources say he killed, the 3 sons of Anak from the land. And so the naming of this city, Kiriath-arba, is signified as the city of these 4 Nephilim or giants. That's where we get the city of 4. That's where we get the city of giants from this And this reference to the children of, or the three sons of Anak plus Anak himself, making four. So isn't that cool? Isn't that funny? We know from Torah that the Anakim were either giants or descendants of giants, whom the second generation Hebrews in the wilderness would mark for destruction in their conquest of the land of Canaan. Now, Numbers describes these giants as Nephilim. Numbers chapter 13, verse 33, in the New American Standard Bible version. And some of the Hebrews that went in to spy out the land fearfully describe these giants in terms of them, the Hebrew spies, being grasshoppers in comparison to the Anakim in size. They were grasshoppers compared to them. We better not go. Well, that everybody but Joshua and Caleb gave this report, because Joshua and Caleb said, we can take them. We can take them. But the other 10 are saying, no, we're like grasshoppers, and you kind of wish you were there to see this growing argument and debate there in front of Moses, and it was just an interesting thing. You gotta love Caleb and Joshua's, especially Caleb at this point, being the one who's saying, dudes, we got this. God is with us. We can take these dudes. We can take these giants, these Nephilim, whatever you want to call them. And so Hebron was one of the Anakim's chief cities of the Anakim. However, we read of no encounters with Anakim during Abraham's history as recorded in Genesis or Bereshit. Now, it's possible that there was interaction between Abraham and some giant. That's not recorded. And interestingly, it's not recorded that he had an interaction with the Anakim in any of the extra biblical references, such as Jasher and Jubilee. So I guess it's conceivable that the Anakim either dwelt in another portion of Hebron or kiriath-arba, or they migrated into the region years later. The text does not provide enough information to say one way or the other. But what I don't know. I really find this whole talk of the Nephilim and all that go back to Genesis 6 and during the conquest, little splices, little nuggets of these giants, the Nephilim, crop up in our readings, and it's just so fascinating to me. So we can see that the writers of the Jerusalem Targum were preoccupied with the former inhabitants of Kiriath-arba, those being the Anakim or Nephilim or giants. Beyond questions of Nephilim and so forth in the land of Kiriath-arba is the larger question as to why Sarah died. And why did she end up in Kiriath-arba or Hebron, where at the time of the binding of Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac, the family lived in Beersheba? Remember from last discussion? Abraham journeyed 3 days from Beersheba to the land of Moriah. So there is. Now, how did Sarah end up in Hebron? Interesting question. At least that's how my brain works, because I'm like, wait a minute. When I started studying this, and I've read this passage many, many times, but this go around, I'm reading it with a different set of eyes and a different focus, and I'm like, whoa, she's in Hebron. Now, I don't know how far, and that's one thing I wish I had checked into now, but I didn't. How far is Hebron from Beersheba? I would imagine it's a good little jaunt, but it's not the same place. And many people don't really think it's worth any kind of attention to be given to, but I do. So it's interesting. Now, rabbinic, along this line, rabbinic thinking identifies Sarah as Yisrael's first matriarch. So she holds a very, very special place in Orthodox Judaism. So in Midrash Rabbah, it explains Abraham's coming to mourn Sarah phrase as being directly tied to Sarah dying as a result of grief that came over her upon learning of the binding of Isaac. Now, we talked about the binding of Isaac in our Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections 19 study, Genesis chapter 22. And if you've not had the opportunity, I would humbly invite you to read or listen to that post. It was one of the most important posts I have done in the last year, I would say. It was, for me, it was spiritually life-changing. I was obsessed with it the entire week in preparing for that discussion. And there were just so much rich content in there and so many life lessons for me that I'm still digesting some of it even to today. So Abraham's coming to mourn Sarah, taking this into account, this rabbinic Midrash Rabbah thinking. His coming to mourn Sarah was Abraham returning from the land of Moriah only to find Sarah, his wife, dead. Now, in the ancient book of Jasher, this is interesting. Chapter 23, by the way, we have a very detailed addendum to last week's Torah reading regarding the binding of Isaac again, leading into this week's reading related to Sarah's passing and Abraham purchasing a plot in which to bury her. Now, the writer of Jasher adds what would otherwise be found between Bereshit 22 and 23, Bereshit again being Hebrew for Genesis chapter 22 and 23, that Hasatan, you're not going to find this in Genesis, our reading, but in Jasher, it talks about Hasatan disguising himself as an old man. Well, he comes to Sarah there in Beersheba. Okay, now we're getting placed into Beersheba, where Abraham had departed many days prior to sacrifice his son, Yitzhak, Isaac. Well, this old man, who was actually Hasatan, according to the text, while Abraham and Isaac were finishing up their business in the land of Moriah, well, Hasatan, as the old man, tells Sarah that Abraham had slaughtered her son Yitzhak and had offered him on an altar as a sacrifice. Imagine that. And this false news, of course, it sent Sarah completely sideways into absolute irreconcilable grief and mourning, even to the point of Sarah uttering that the laughter she found in being Yitzhak's mother had now turned into grief and mourning. Now, whether you buy that or not, it's still touching. It still grabs you. It still takes you to a place of, if this were true, how would Sarah take it, knowing that this was Sarah's only child, that she bore at age 90, that she was so in love with? And so the story goes that despite her consoling herself ultimately after learning this from this old man that I'm assuming had gone away after that, after informing her of this, she set out to the byways, desperately searching for her son. Ultimately, she came to Hebron, or Kiriath-arba. That's how she got there. Assuming this story is true, because it is an extra biblical reference. We take it with careful acceptance. Some people believe that Jasher is scripture, that it is that ancient book described in Joshua, Jasher. Where do I stand on Jasher? How should I describe my stance? I wouldn't go so far as saying it's absolute scripture, but I believe it is a biblical resource that is important. It is a biblical resource that is absolutely important. And I would rank it up there with the Maccabees, first and second Maccabees, and some of the other extra biblical books that were written by the inspiration of Jehovah, Yahweh, Yahuwah, however you declare his name. So that I believe that what is contained in Jasher, not so much Jubilees, but Jasher, is extra or information that we don't get in the other books of Tanakh. Of Torah. So in this case, this answers the question beautifully. How did her remains, how did she end up in Hebron when she resided in Beersheba? Sorry, I had a brain dump for a minute. But she ends up in Hebron, in Kiriath-arba, and she arrives ultimately at Shem and Eber's home. Shem and Eber's home, okay? I don't want to go I don't want to get off topic here, but that's interesting. Shem and Eber. Shem's still alive? Anyway, but to no avail did she find her husband and son. So Hasatan, here he comes again, disguises himself as the old man. Forgive me if you hear in the background, the landscapers are out in force today, and it is preparation day, and they tend to be out in huge force. So I will try to overspeak them. But he disguises himself as that same old man again, and he approaches Sarah a second time, this time in Hebron, in Kiriath-arba, and informs her that which he told her back in Beersheba, now get this, that which he told her regarding Isaac being sacrificed and burnt up on the altar by her husband, well, that which he told her was incorrect. Yitzchak had not been sacrificed by her husband, and he was very much alive. What kind of... You can't make this stuff up. This probably sounds true. This is probably definitely true, because this is crazy. This is the kind of stuff Hasatan would do. But I leave you to ponder your position on Jasher. But this news, this corrected news that Sarah receives causes Sarah so much emotional stress and distress that she died there in Hebron. That's why she died, according to Jasher. So in the interim, Abraham and Yitzchak had completed their worship in the land of Moriah, and they had returned back to their home in where? Beersheba. Sarah, of course, was nowhere to be found by them, and Abraham conducts a desperate search for his wife, only to learn that she had traveled to Hebron. Why? In search of them, in search of her husband, Abraham, and her son, Yitzchak, or Isaac. So in response to that trip that Sarah had taken, Abraham and Yitzchak hastened to Hebron to find, Abraham to find his wife, Yitzchak to find his mom. Tragically, upon arriving in Hebron, they learned of Sarah's sudden death. And both Abraham and Yitzchak are described as quote, mourning over her a great and heavy mourning, end quote. Now, I will mention here that neither Josephus nor Jubilees record any such addendum to the Genesis or the Bereshit account of Sarah's death. The only added information to the overall Bereshit account is that after the binding of Yitzhak, the binding of Isaac incident, Abraham and Yitzhak, or Isaac, returned to and sojourned in Beersheba, presumably with Sarah. And they dwelled in Beersheba after the binding of Isaac incident for many years. And so after the passing of those years, the family pulled up stakes for no expressed reason and returned to Hebron or Kiriath-arba, where they sojourned 14 years. And it was after those 14 years spent in Hebron that Sarah died. Now, we kind of have two conflicting accounts of Sarah's death, and they're kind of significant differences. And we're kind of left to just take what information we have from these sources and just kind of use them as the Spirit leads. I don't know what else to really say regarding that, because it is a little slight difference that is kind of, I wouldn't say troubling, but a little disconcerting. So the Orthodox midrash of the passing of Sarah seems somewhat consistent, though, with the Jasher accounting, if you ask me. And the interesting thing about the Jasher record is that the writer attributes Sarah's death, although he does so indirectly, to the devious works of Hasatan, while the Bereshit, the Josephus, the Jubilee accounts leave us clueless as to the cause of Sarah's death. Now, I would caution us to attribute Sarah's death simply to old age, because that's what a lot of people, she was 127 years old. That's why she died of old age. But again, bear in mind that Abraham was roughly 10 years her senior, putting him at 137 years in this reading. And we will find in future readings that that wasn't even the end for Abraham. He will go on to father several children in his hundreds, beyond Yitzhak, ultimately dying at the ripe old age of 175. So this is a fascinating story. Let's continue on to verse 3. And it reads, "And Abraham rose from before his dead, and he spoke to the Hittites." Let's stop here. It should be noted that, especially here, that in Orthodox Judaism, when a person dies, their family and friends will engage in a ritual or tradition, and you may have heard this or you may not have, that is referred to as sitting Shiva. Sitting, as in the act of sitting in a chair, and Shiva. And Shiva can be spelled as S-H-I-V-A or S-H-I-V-A-H, depending on what sources or resources you references. But this ritual or this tradition of sitting Shiva, it involves the family and friends sitting down on the floor or even on the ground in many cases and mourning for the deceased for 7 days. Now, I'm sure the rabbis have I've never really done a whole lot of research on this, but the rabbis, I'm sure, have rules around it on what it means and what it requires to sit in Shiva. But that's beyond the scope of our discussion here today. But during the time of mourning, the next of kin is consoled in this sitting Shiva by attending friends, attending relatives, and of course associates who stopped by to, pass on their condolences. Now, some Jewish sources believe this tradition of sitting Shiva goes back to Abraham and the time of our Torah reading here, the death of Sarah. And so what we see taking place here is believed by some to be a nascent or an early form of sitting Shiva. Thus, the Abrahams and their friends and their associates engaged in an unrevealed period of deep mourning. At the end of that mourning period, Abraham raises up from, let's say, his sitting Shiva and goes to take care of the business of burying his wife. And I say unrevealed period of deep mourning because the passage does not tell us how long. But the tradition of sitting Shiva is 7 days. Now, who knows? This could be a nascent or an early form of sitting Shiva, or it may not be. But we don't know how long Abraham and Yitzchak and the family sat in their mourning. Interestingly, the ancient book of Jasher somewhat jives with this idea that maybe sitting Shiva or has some traces back to this incident. It's noted in the 24th chapter of the ancient book of Jasher that Abraham went into great mourning and performed the rites of mourning for 7 days, and that all the inhabitants of the land comforted Abraham and Yitzchak. Pretty interesting, huh? And it kind of lends into the rabbinic thought that sitting Shiva and mourning for the loved one's death has direct ties to this story. Now, other than what I've just mentioned, I know nothing more about the tradition or ritual of sitting Shiva, but I'm certain, like most traditions and rituals, in Orthodox Judaism, there are rabbinic rules attached to it. The text records that Abraham rose from before his dead, indicating that during the time of mourning, during this time of great mourning and grief, Abraham and his family sat and slept on the ground. And this is referenced in two passages in Scripture, 2 Samuel 12:16 and Lamentations chapter 2, verse 10. And so Abraham rises from his mourning, and he goes to one of the main inhabitants of that land, the Hittites, to acquire a burial plot for Sarah, his wife. And these Hittites are and will be referred to by me here in this discussion on a number of occasions as children of Heth, since they descended from Canaan and Heth. Now, I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing Heth, H-E-T-H, properly. It could be Heath, but let's just go with Heth for the moment. And if I'm wrong, forgive me. But again, I'm not a Hebrew expert or I am not versed in Hebrew. I struggle with it. It is one of the banes to my existence. But we have to do what we have to do. We contend with these types of things. So, moving on to verse 4. And it reads, saying, and this is Abraham speaking to the Hittites, I am a sojourning settler with you. I am a sojourning settler with you. And he continues, grant me a burial holding with you, and let me bury my dead now before me. Let's stop here. Abraham describes his status in the land as one of sojourner and settler. And it turns out that this is a legal term used in the ancient Near East to designate an individual as a resident alien. Abraham is quite skilled at carefully articulating what he no doubt recognized as the tenuousness, if you will, of his legal residential status in the land. It was a reality, despite the fact that the unconditional covenant he held with Yah, contained therein was the provision that clearly stipulated that that very land the whole of it actually, that he would be attempting to purchase just to bury Sarah belonged to him and his seed. He owned that land by covenant rights. And this is the crux of our reading here today. And that is, we are sojourners, like Abraham. We are sojourners in a land and in a world that has been promised to us as an inheritance. Yet, at the moment, this world is not our home. It doesn't belong to us just yet. And the writer of Hebrews speaks to this reality when extolling the faithful virtues of the patriarchs. Hebrews chapter 11, verses 9 and 13. And the King James Version reads, "By faith, he," talking about Abraham, "sojourned in the land of promise, as in a strange company, dwelling in tabernacles or tents with Yitzhak or Isaac and Yaakov or Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise." Verse 13, "These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them from afar, and were persuaded of them, and embraced them, and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims on the earth." Praise Yah. Orthodox Jewish thinking would place the Jew in this world as a resident. Consequently, he or she is instructed by Torah, whichever Torah the sages happen to be referring to here, to deal with this reality of inhabiting and elevating this world as opposed to trying to evade or escape the world. And the greatest reality is that the Jew is meant to provide a, quote, dwelling for God in the material realm by sanctifying the everyday materials of everyday life, end quote. And so, in this sense, the Orthodox Jew sees him or herself as a stranger in this world. And this is primarily because his or her true home is located in the spirit realm, and he or she must exist in holiness and godliness. And this is the thinking of one of their Jewish sages, if you will, Leva Victor Rebbe. I don't know who he is, but he is one of the renowned rabbis. I've heard this name I've seen this name quoted and mentioned in many writings, Jewish writings. Now, let me just add right here before we go any further, as when I'm talking to you or we're discussing these Torah readings and I insert information on Orthodox rabbinic Jewish thinking, I'm not here trying to push or promote anything having to do with us following Judaism, us adopting Jewish thoughts. I do this because I want us to have a rounded understanding of what these passages, these readings, have to offer us in terms of content, in terms of way of living, in terms of history and culture and so forth and so forth. And because our wayward cousins, the Jews and Judaism, play such a huge role in our faith, whether we want to admit it or not, because our master, Yehoshua, was an Orthodox Jew. And we're going to touch on that in a little bit here. But we can't hide our heads in the sand and ignore what our wayward cousins in Judaism put forward. I guess we could, and a lot of people do. But what I want to offer here in my studies is what the Orthodox rabbinic Jews think as it relates to these things. Now, most of the time, their thoughts are gibberish, as I note. They're gibberish, but sometimes, on rare occasions, such as this, they get it. They get it. And in this sense, they recognize that there is an element of Yah's people being sojourners in the land. And that we must represent and image Yah in the earth during our sojourning in the land. So in this sense, they get it. So that's what I wanted to pass on. And that's how I think, and that's how I approach this. So I hope that you kind of understand that and you're not offended by me from time to time inserting these little tidbits into our discussion. So I also wanted to mention here that in Abraham's mentioning to the Hittites his legal or residential status in the land, that he was affirming to them, or he was stating the obvious, that unlike them, he owned no real property. He owned no land. Abraham, conversely, lived in tents, as the writer of Hebrews just mentioned, and he lived the life as of a Bedouin, a nomad, traveling here and there with his family and servants and his flocks. Remember, he was residing at some point and for many years in Beersheba. And he's resided here in Hebron off and on throughout his life. So this is a very interesting thing when you consider and you contrast that Yah promised him the very land that he is trying to purchase, or will be trying to purchase, a burial plot on. That the land belonged to him and to his seed, the Abrahamic covenant. Major part of the Abrahamic covenant. So in Abraham's opening statement here to the Hittite council, it could be seen as a means of setting himself up to be officially admitted into the community, or as rather a permanent resident, made permanent through the acquisition of real estate. If one could go so far as calling the purchase of a burial plot real estate. But we will see that the acquisition of this burial cave, this burial plot, if you would come with a parcel of land, making Abraham what? An official member of Hebron, official citizen of Hebron, of kiriath-arba. And the point we will see is real life. This is the point. And Abraham acutely knew this. If you don't pay for something, you really don't own it. And this was the dilemma that Abraham was facing. He could remain a sojourner in the land, and he would remain a sojourner in the land if he did not own any property in the land. But the only way to get property in the land is to purchase it. Well, Rod, it was offered to him for free. He could have but here's the problem. There's no free lunches in the world. No free lunches. Regardless, the irony to be had here, that in heaven's eyes, Abraham already owned all the land of the Hittites, yet for now, Abraham had to pay for it. You see, if he was given the land, if he was given the cave, what would stop a Hittite from coming back and taking claim to it? Oh, you gave it to me. Show me the proof. Or it was just a loaner. We draw from this verse a couple of mainstays as it relates to how the members of the original Hebrew faith treated their dead, though. And one, they paid respect for their deceased loved ones by mourning them for a defined period of time. And two, they buried their loved ones. The loved one, or the love we have, I should say, the love we have for one another and the members of our family as covenant members will reflect in the way we treat those who die in our midst. And despite Abraham's steadfast, deep, abiding relationship with Yah, the steadfast, deep, and abiding love and relationship he had with Sarah simply cannot be overlooked here. He wailed, he mourned for his wife, and he sat, if you will, in Shiva for an undetermined period or unmentioned or unrecorded amount of time. So this talks to us in a way about loving our wives, the importance of Yah's people, Yah's men in particular, loving their wife. Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, wrote that we men ought to love our wives as our own bodies. Ephesians chapter 5, verse 28 and 33. Beloved, it comes as no great mystery or secret that many men come into this faith of ours and they, for whatever reason, lose the love they once had for their wives. They get so they get so caught up in this wanting to be Jewish with all the trappings and things, and they take on this goofy mentality that women are second or third class citizens, and they want them to be separated from them during worship services, and they want to relegate them to doing menial tasks in the home, and they don't pay them any attention, and they talk down to them, and they mistreat them, and they get this sense that men are the great heads, and men are supposed to be the head of the family, yes, but they don't value and love their wives. They lose that love. They lose sight of, we must remember Yah's original purpose of marriage. And that purpose was to fulfill in his human creation, not only the proper method for procreation, the proper means of creation, but to create a means of complete worship of Yah. What do I mean by that? Well, combined, a biblically based covenant-keeping husband and wife team are capable as a unified couple to worship and glorify Father beyond that of just the single man or woman. And I would invite you, I talk about this extensively in my marriage. It was a series that I did. I'll search and put the link to that series, at least one of the posts in this reading's transcript for your convenience, and that was a couple years ago, I believe. But this is the purpose, this is the gist, this is the drive of biblical marriage, Yah's original intent for marriage. And so under such a paradigm, the paradigm being Yah's original intent and purpose for marriage, the true man of Yah will love his wife. And he'll love his wife as much as he loves himself. Indeed, that love is at a different level than the love he will have for Jehovah. The love that he will have for Elohim, for Jehovah, is one that incorporates the healthy, loving relationship he has with his wife. And vice versa for the woman. I'm not just talking men only here, but I'm focusing on men, but this also applies to the wife. You see, it's not about choosing Yah over one's spouse. The understanding being that our spouse completes us, as corny as that might be, borrowing it from a movie back from years ago. You complete me. The understanding being that our spouse completes us, and our spouse, the two facilitates worship and the covenant relationship with the Almighty. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And so we see here in our Torah reading, despite it being absent in all our previous reading involving Abraham, we see evidence of Abraham's deep and abiding love for his wife, Sarah. It's very romantic and it's very touching. And I say that this serves as an example. And it serves as, or should serve as, a reminder of the love we men must have for our wives. Now, in terms of burial, it was and remains the primary means of caring for the remains of Hebrew loved ones. Some Jewish commentators assert that cremation is repugnant to Judaism and that it defies both the oral and written laws. In terms of those of us in the Hebrew faith, the question of whether or not to cremate or that cremation is prohibited as the rabbis say it is, it's not supported in Scripture. And I want to touch on this issue of cremation versus burial at the end of our discussion here today in our practical Messianic Halakha section. I have a commentary that I want to put forth to you on that and give you my thoughts. But another aspect of this reading that I wish to touch upon is the importance of recognizing our pilgrim status in the world. Beloved, as materially and physically depicted in Abraham's life, he being covenanted the land during his life existed as a sojourner, as a nomad of sorts, living in tents, with all his great wealth and his flocks, having no physical possession or ownership of the land. We are sojourners. We are nomads in this world because this world is not our home. So we have no business delving into the affairs of this world and its governments and societies beyond our having to live and operate for purposes of sustaining and caring for ourselves and our families. Yes, we have to go out and earn a living. So we have to interact with the world. There's no way out of that. We have to go shopping for food. We have to pay our bills. We have to register our cars. We have to do all kinds of things in society. But we're not called to insert ourselves in the affairs of society, especially in politics and in other elements and aspects of the day, of society, of secular society. You know, there's a popularity out there these days of being a patriot. And this really came to a head during the Donald Trump years as president. This thought of being a patriot, being a Trumper, this idea of being, what is the word I want to use? Oh, Rod, you just dumped it, didn't you? But I hope you get a social justice warrior, social justice warrior, going out and righting all the wrongs and protesting in front of abortion clinics and as anti-Torah as it is, abortion is, the killing of babies, the offering them to Moloch is. I mean, are we really called out to stand and protest in front of abortion clinics? Or protesting out in the street? Beloved, I know people who vehemently, who aggressively support the Black Lives Matter movement. And when you know what this movement really is, and when you look at all of these movements and the protests that ensue in the aftermath or in the wake of these movements and so forth, you come back to the very point. You have no business in it as a child of Yah. These are secular, some of them even demonically founded things, founded demonic organizations and such. This is, it's bad. I mean, I was shocked to hear that this is a Messianic who advocates. And if the opportunity presented, he'd be out there doing the marching there with a Black Lives Matter. Really? Are you serious? But I'm getting off course here. I find it fascinating that hardcore Messianics find themselves on the front lines of the modern day social justice warrior situation that has gripped this nation. This patriotism, these are deep into claiming that they believe, or what they believe is rightfully theirs in this country. And many are claiming that which they believe to be rightfully theirs in the name of Jesus. I guess in many ways, this is part and parcel of the dominion theology, or dominionism as it's otherwise known, political belief system that gripped a great chunk of evangelical Christianity, about 5 years ago as Trump was running for office. Dominion theology, for those of you who may not be familiar with the phrase or title or mindset, is the mindset that certain sects of evangelical Christians, or that certain evangelical Christians have, related to taking this nation back for Christ. There is essentially a false sense that God will use the church, triumphant, to usher in an age where the nation will be governed by Christian principles and ideologies. The problem with this wishful thinking and this belief system is that those who hold to such theological thinking are evidently poor students of Scripture. That's what they are. Even the most immature Christian will have some knowledge that this world, including this nation, is governed by the demigod of this world, Hasatan and his ilk. Ephesians chapter 2, verses 2 and 3. Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12, John chapter 8, verse 44, and John chapter 12, verse 31. And the only way that this nation, much less this world, will ever come into full compliance with the laws and ways of the kingdom of Yah is when Yehoshua returns and he restores paradise lost, and he binds and confines Hasatan and his ilk for 1,000 years. Revelation chapter 20, verses 2 through 7. Beloved, none of what I'm saying here is meant to be demoralizing or critical. But dominion theology and its various spin-offs are contrivances meant to mislead Yah's people by focusing their attention on the present kingdoms of this world instead of the coming kingdom of Yah. That's where our purpose, that's where our focus must be. Seek ye first the kingdom of Yah and his righteousness. Matthew 6:33, love one another as he loved us. Keep his commandments, which are his Father's commandments, him being Yeshua, which are the commandments contained in Torah, John 14:15 and John 15:10. Take up our cross and follow him, which means to leave everything behind and die to self and be his disciple. Matthew 16:24 and Mark 8:34. And make disciples of all nations. Matthew 28:19. This is the instructions Yah gave us. He didn't tell us to go out and be social justice warriors. All of this means that we've not been called to do that. We have a job to do. And it's laid out there in Scripture for us. And we have a blessed hope. Which, that blessed hope of that coming kingdom, it should energize us and it should help us focus on the tasks that have been given to us. Titus chapter 2, verse 13. So, yes, seek the kingdom first. Love one another. Keep Yah's commandments. Keep Yeshua's commandments. Take up our cross and follow him. Make disciples of all nations. That's our focus. Well, I got off track. Let's go on to verse 5. And the Hittites answered Abraham, saying, Pray, hear us, my Lord. Pray, hear us, my Lord. Let's stop there for a moment. It should be noted that from a biographical, standpoint, that these Hittites, the text and notes, were descendants of Canaan's son Heth, or Heath. And this is evident in Genesis or Bereshit, chapter 10, verse 15, Genesis, or Bereshit, chapter 23, verse 3, verse 5, and 20. And their general geographical dwelling was Hebron, which is the place where our story is taking place today. Genesis 23, verses 2, 3, and 19. Now, the Hittites, no doubt the descendants of these very folks whom Abraham sojourned amongst, Yisrael would be tasked with utterly destroying them, which they did not fully accomplish as commanded. Deuteronomy chapter 7, verse 1 and 2. Why were these marked for destruction by Yah? Clearly, these descendants of Heth or Heath were engaged in pagan worship that Yah did not approve of. Exodus chapter 23, verses 23 and 24. And so Jehovah described their pagan practices as abominable. Deuteronomy chapter 20, verse 17. But for the moment, as it pertains to this story, these Hittites, this generation basically ruled the region of Hebron, and Abraham had to conduct business and engage socially with them since he was sojourning in their land. Verse 6, and it reads, "You are a prince." This is the Hittites addressing Abraham. "You are a prince of God among us. In the pick of our graves, bury your dead. No man among us will deny you his grave for burying your dead." Wow. Let's stop here for a moment. The LXX, or the Septuagint, notes the Hittites referring to Abraham as, quote, "a king from God," while the Onkelos, this is another rabbinic commentary, interpretation, or translation of Torah, notes the Hittites referring to Abraham as prince before the Lord among them. A prince before the Lord among them. M.H. Gottstein suggests that the actual reference these men made towards Abraham may be more in line with the Hebrew terminology of Nazi Elohim. Nazi Elohim, or Prince of Elohim, Prince of God, Prince of Yehovah. There are many people in our messianic circles that refer to themselves as Nazis, as prince. I'm thinking of one in particular who has a congregation, a rather large messianic congregation in Tennessee. And one of his titles, apart from rabbi, is Nazi. A little bit presumptive, a little arrogant in my perspective, but okay, that's what he abides by, and that's what the people have gifted him as this title, and he loves it. But anyway, it was common in formal gatherings of the ancient Near East for folks to address people in what is described as the superlative. The superlative. In this case, the men referred to Abraham as mighty prince. And some scholars attribute a meaning to that of a tribal chief. That is the comparison thereof. A tribal chief is revered in the tribe. It can't be ignored, regardless what the so-called self-professing scholars say, that the locals of Hebron recognized Abraham as having a special relationship with Yehovah. Thus, the given title Prince of Elohim, Nazi Elohim, it's not that these Hittites served or worshipped Yehovah, but rather, they probably didn't, but rather these ancient ones recognized multiple gods, and they were sensitive to the influences certain gods had within and outside their community, which is a strong statement when comparing the sensibility of folks back then to now. Questions of intelligence and sophistication aside, friends, the ancients were a bit more sensitive to spiritual things than this 21st century generation of ours. And so these gentlemen recognized that there was something exceptional about Abraham and Abraham's relationship with this God El, this Yehovah, Yahweh Yehovah. And these no doubt were so well aware of Abraham's many miraculous exploits and Abraham's exclusive worship of the one God, Yehovah. Jehovah's history among the Hittites, it stretched back many decades. Genesis chapter 13, verse 18. So this is not his first rodeo with the Hittites. And of course, the Hittites were no doubt, they had a pantheon of gods that they worshiped. And let's be honest, they no doubt knew of Jehovah. And maybe some of them even maybe worshiped him as part of their pantheon. But generally, they were, what is the word for the worshiping multiple gods? Can't remember. I've lost that thought. But anyway, that's likely what we have here with the Hittites in terms of their relationship with Yah and their understanding of Abraham being solely tied to Jehovah, the one God. And although it is likely that these Hittites didn't worship Yah exclusively, but rather in a pantheon, or if they did, they worship Yah within the framework of that pantheon of gods, they held an appreciable degree of respect for the aged patriarch of the Hebrew faith, Abraham. And as a result of that respect, they generously offer Abraham, as the English Standard Version commentary describes, quote, the use of one of the choicest of their own tombs for the burial of Sarah, end quote. It's interesting to see how beautifully laid out here the respect the children of Heth or Heath had for Abraham. So much so that something as personal and as important as procuring a burial plot for his family member, despite him being a recognized sojourner in their country, would be rendered unto him without price. In other words, you, Abraham, you're respected among our people. By all means, man, a burial plot from any of the families our people, select one. Take a burial plot from any of the families of our people, and you go ahead and you bury your loved one. No one's going to deny you that privilege. You see, although Abraham would ultimately agree to pay full price for a parcel of burial property there in Hebron, the heathen of the land was willing to accommodate the patriarch's need for or need of burying his loved one. For certainly this is a lesson in personal conduct and righteous living. When we live in accordance with Yah's instructions in righteousness, and when we treat our fellow man according to those instructions in righteousness, we become a testimony to the unconverted world. We really do. Yes, the unconverted world will persecute us, and at some point, they're going to martyr us, if Yah wills for us to remain at that time. But in the interim, when we live uncompromisingly, if that is such a word, and we live uncompromisingly in Yah's ways, even the unconverted will respect us. They may not like us. They probably don't. They may ridicule us, but they will be forced to respect us. In responding to a theological challenge by a Jewish lawyer regarding which was the greatest Torah law, Master replied in Matthew chapter 22, verses 37 through 40, thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. Verse 38, this is the first and great commandment. Verse 39, and the second is like unto it, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. And this is the kicker, verse 40, on these two commandments hang all the law and the prophets. Now, does that mean that we're only supposed to love our neighbor and love Yah? That's why that is the traditionalists, the denominationalists say. That's the only law we need to follow. Well, how do you know how to love your neighbor? How do you know how to love Yah? Your perspective, your understanding of how to love Yah, in many ways is probably different than mine would be. Oh, and more so different than what Yah's would be. So Yah has specifics on how he wants to be loved. Yah has specifics on how we should treat and love our neighbor. So this is extremely important. So how do we know this? How do we figure out what that love looks like? by living and walking Torah. Period. Clearly, Abraham honored these mitzvah. And the result of him doing so, walking in Yah's way, walking in covenant, was Yah's friendship and respect for those outside his camp. He gained and earned the respect of the pagans that lived around him. Verse 7, and Abraham rose and bowed to the folk in the land, to the Hittites. Let's stop here. The folk in, or folk of the land, in Hebrew is Am haaretz. Am haaretz. In context here is specifically referring to what some biblical scholars see as an assembled council of Hittites. Now, that which was to be proposed by Abraham, that being the acquisition of a burial plot for Sarah in ancient Near East, would require some consensus on the part of the local council. He couldn't just go in and acquire a plot. It had to have some element of consensus from the region, the folks in that area, a council, the leaders of that society. They want to know who's going to be residing around them. They want to know who is who in the zoo. And they don't take too kindly to folks who are not owners of the land. Rabbinic sources state that of the 49 times that this Hebrew phrase is recorded in the Tanakh, 42 of those Am haaretz mentions point specifically to some political or social event. In this particular instance, Am haaretz is about this ancient Hittite council or assembly. Let's go to verses 8 and 9, which read, and he spoke with them, to them being the council, the Hittite council, saying, if you have it in your hearts that I should bury my dead now before me, hear me, listen to what I have to say, entreat for me Ephron, son of Zohar. Verse 9, and let him grant me the cave of Machpelah that belongs to him, which is at the far end of his field. At the full price, let him grant it to me in your midst as a burial holding. Let's stop here. It sounds like Abraham has done his research, his homework. He knows who owns the cave of Machpelah. Now, regarding this cave of Machpelah, the so-called sages cannot let even something like this go without a good story attached to it. According to some, this cave was unique in that it had an upper and it had a lower chamber, and those chambers served as the resting place for multiple couples, and to include, get this, Adam and Eve, Abraham and Sarah, of course, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. I found such thinking to be slightly entertaining, but also revealing. Could I be wrong? Yeah. Maybe they are buried there, but I doubt I doubt Adam and Eve are buried there. Because this shows us that even some of the most innocuous elements in Torah can have the elements added to it by the very ones that, being sages, who should know better than to add to or take away from Yah's word. This is what they're doing when they do this. Yah's instructions in righteousness. It's one thing to surmise what something meant or looked like as recorded in Scripture, but it's an entirely different thing to make such bold assertions when no such evidence is to be had from the written word. Don't add to or take away from his word. Just thought I'd share with you this fun rabbinic tidbit, though. So, the $21.67 question that yearns for an answer here is, why would Abraham turn down a free burial plot? Remember, just in 2 verses prior, that it was told to Abraham, look, you can have your choice of the plots out here, of the caves, and we'll give them to you free of charge. Why would Abraham turn down a free burial plot? Because he now says, I will pay you full price. He's talking to Ephron. He wants Ephron to sell him the cave of Machpelah at full price. Why would he do that? He'd been offered burial property for free by the Hittites, yet he insists on not just purchasing the property, but in paying full price. Why? The most likely answer is that by him paying full price for the plot, there would never be any question of his ownership of that property. If Abraham were to accept the property for free, what would prevent the original owner or his descendants from coming back and laying claim to that land sometime in the future? If the land were conveyed to Abraham for free, he'd have no true claim of ownership of it. However, if Abraham paid full price for the property, he'd have that claim of ownership. As an aside, this verse is a testimony to the fact that it was a very common practice among many communities of the ancient Near East to bury their dead in caves. So Abraham's request of the Hittite assembly or council that he acquires one of the council members' caves to serve as a burial site for Sarah would not have been an unusual one. And this tradition and practice of burying a loved one in a cave carried over into the Hebrew faith, at least well into the first century of the Common Era. Recall that our master Yehoshua was buried in a borrowed tomb, which could be categorized as a cave of sorts. John chapter 19, verses 38 and 42. My dear brother Robert Bills pointed me to a book entitled Golgotha, written by a Robert Cornuke. It's either Cornuke or Cornuki. Oh my gosh, I butcher names. I am so sorry. Well, now, despite the book's emphasis being to bring to the reader's attention evidence that the traditional locations for the Temple Mount and Golgotha are not incorrect, the focus was on the book, I should say, that the traditional locations are incorrect, he believes. The author does a fantastic job, though, revealing to the reader the most likely place Yeshua was buried for those, not only was buried, but was crucified and then was buried for those 3 days and 3 nights. And that likely place was a rocky escarpment with multiple cave-like intrusions in it, and those cave-like intrusions served as burial places for many of the citizens of Jerusalem in Yehoshua's day. So the practice of burying the Jewish burial, let's say, in Yeshua's day was in caves or in that type of environment. So what we have here in terms of Abraham attempting to acquire a cave to bury Sarah in is somewhat of an important issue. And later I will comment further on this very touchy issue of Hebrews burying their dead. Let's go to verse 10. And Ephron was sitting in the midst of the Hittites, and Ephron the Hittite answered Abraham in the hearing of the Hittites, all the assembled in the gate of his town, saying, and let's stop here. The mention here of Ephron sitting in the midst of the children of Heth or Heath is suggestive to some biblical commentators that he was actually presiding over what some have described, and I talked about this earlier, described here as an assembly or council, a Hittite assembly or council. To me, the fact that the text emphasizes that Ephron was, quote, sitting in the midst of the Hittites, end quote, makes his leadership of council appear to be a reasonable conclusion. And why not? Abraham, who the citizens of Hebron referred to as a Nazi Elohim, the Prince of Elohim, the Prince of Jehovah, entering into an important business transaction with one of the principal leaders of this Hittite community. It's a very interesting story and dynamic here. It should be noted that what we are reading here is an example of a common land ownership transaction and transfer. Virtually all such important legal business transactions customarily took place at the city's gateway. As such, the men of the city would assemble themselves in a sort of a town council and conduct their business. So what we're seeing here is most certainly a legal business transcription or transaction common to the ancient Near East. Even the dialogue that is recorded here between Ephron and Avraham is typical of ancient Near East financial documents that recorded the conveyance of property. Now, the second half of the verse mentions that Ephron answered Avraham in the hearing of the Hittites and all the assembled in the gate of his town. Now, some biblical scholars suggest that this verse paints an eye-opening picture of the common practice of ancient Near East business and political discourse being conducted, not only in open public, mind you, but also conducting those business transactions at the city's gate. In this case, Kiriath-arba's city gate, Hebron's city gate. And certainly, Abraham's intentions to acquire a suitable burial site for his deceased wife was of such a major concern that he wanted the transaction to be done in an open and transparent environment that was witnessed by what? Many individuals, both within and outside the Hittite council. And of course, such important transactions required witnesses and transparency, and the gate of Kiriath-arba, the gate of Hebron, offered that environment. And we will find that indeed Abraham's purchase was witnessed by several people in verse 18. Let's go into verse 11. Pray, my Lord, hear me. The field, this is Ephron talking. Pray, my Lord, hear me. The field I grant you, and the cave that is in it. So he's given him the field and the cave. But there's a price. I grant it to you in full view of my kinsfolk. I grant it to you. Go bury your dead. Let's stop here. Now, Alter's translation once again takes on the issue that we touched on in our previous reading, having to do with the exhortation, if you will. The exhortation insertion that translates in the English as, I pray thee, I pray, or pray. Now, depending on which Hebrew manuscript is referenced, the insertion may be that of pray, which we see here, or no, like nada, no, as we see in virtually every English translation that is based on the Masoretic Hebrew manuscript. So, depending on which translation, Ephron was saying, no, my Lord, no, you listen to me. Or, as Alter translates, pray, an exhortation. Listen to me, if you will, please. So it's very interesting, the detail that we can get into. So it's a conflict, and when we're talking about this insertion of exhortation, it's a conflict between the Hebrew word lu for pray versus lo for no. And Alter explains that what we have here is more likely Ephron employing and inserting politeness in his discussions with Abraham instead of becoming turt with him and saying, no, listen, stop. Now, Alter also points out a rather interesting fact. Abraham, when he first proposes purchasing property in which to bury Sarah, he endeavors to purchase Ephron's cave. That's it. But then Ephron throws in the surrounding land upon which the cave sits, which is curious. And it would seem at first brush that Ephron was perhaps showing Abraham favor by giving him more than he'd ever bargained for. But Alter senses an ulterior motive behind Ephron's seeming generous offer. Alter suggests that Ephron's throwing in the land with the cave. Tell her what he wins, Jack. This throwing in the land with the cave was a ploy, actually, to extract more money from Abraham, which seems to be a reasonable assertion. Given the final purchase price charged to Abraham, Abraham will essentially overpay for this property. And again, we see in this verse another beautiful example of a common ancient Near East business transaction practice or protocol. Ephron's three-pronged, I grant you, I grant it to you, I grant it to you, and this threesome is a formal conference or a conference of the property from him to Abraham. And what we see here is Ephron essentially trying to close the deal. Okay, let's move on over to verses 12 through 15. Verse 12, and Abraham bowed before the folk of the land. Verse 13, saying, if you would but hear me, I give the price of the field. Take it from me and let me bury my dead there. Verse 14, and Ephron answered Abraham saying, verse 15, pray, again, pray, please, my Lord, hear me. Land for 400 silver shekels between me and you. What does it come to? Or in some other translations, is what's 400 shekels of silver between you and me? Let's stop here. So Ephron's asking price here for the cave and the land is certainly ambiguous to our 21st century Western experiences and ignorance of ancient Near East monetary values. We really can't tell exactly how much that was worth. I mean, some people try to make they try to be cool and put out what a value is. I think one person said it was $2,000, worth $2,000. I think it was Hertz that said that in his commentary. But Alter attempts to help put this price of 400 silver shekels in perspective, and he does so by comparing it to the purchase price of property that is recorded in other parts of Scripture. And although he doesn't provide us insight into what passages he compared Abraham's purchase with, he does come to the conclusion that Abraham sorely overpaid Ephron for his property. Now, as distasteful as this may seem to us, that is Ephron's taking advantage of Abraham, we have to make allowances for Ephron. Abraham is recorded in verse 13 as stating to Ephron that he would pay him full price for his property. So when Ephron all but robs Abraham here in this verse, we have to recognize that from a business sense, a business standpoint, Abraham did not have much of a financial leg to stand on here. And we will see in the next verse that Abraham recognized this reality and humbly agreed to the deal without any counter offering. Verse 16, go bury your dead. And Abraham heeded. That is, Abraham agreed to Ephron's offer. Ephron and Abraham then weigh out to Ephron the silver that he spoke of in the hearing of the Hittites, 400 silver shekels at the merchant's tried weight. Stop here. The terminology of 400 shekels of silver, it predates. It is before the use of money, of coins, which means that this 400 shekels is indicative of that payment in silver being tendered using agreed upon weights, which essentially what shekels means in ancient Near East context. So Ephron makes it clear that his asking price is 400 silver shekels, despite the little dance he does with seemingly throwing out the arbitrary number of 400 shekels, what's it between us? Which actually is not an arbitrary price. The 400 silver shekels is what Ephron felt and or what he wanted, more or less, for his property. It was indeed his asking price for the property. And it was now up to Abraham to formally agree to the price and ante up the silver, which he did. Verses 17 and 18. 17, and Ephron's field at Machpelah by Mamre, the field and the cave that was in it, and every tree in the field within its boundaries all around. Verse 18, well, it passed over to Abraham as a possession, in full view of the Hittites, all the assembled in the gate of his town. Let's stop here. The ancient book of Jasher records that Abraham, quote, wrote this transaction, and he wrote it and testified it with 4 witnesses, end quote. And that's Jasher chapter 24, verse 7. In the very next verse of Jasher in chapter 24 lists the names of those witnesses, which I won't go into here. And Jasher proceeds to record that Abraham kept this purchase agreement, if you will. And he kept it for purposes of documenting that this burial plot would be his and his seed's possession forever, verse 10. And in confirmation of this agreement being some sort of covenant, Jasher notes that the purchase of the field and the cave, quote, were made sure unto Abraham and unto his seed after him from the children of Heth, or Heath. Let's go on to verse 19 and 20. Verse 19, and then Abraham buried Sarah, his wife, in the cave of Machpelah field by Mamre, which is Hebron, in the land of Canaan. Verse 20, the last verse in the passage, and the field and the cave that was in it passed over to Abraham as a burial holding from the Hittites. Okay, so Alter concludes that what we have recorded here in these 4 concluding verses is emblematic of financial transactions involving the conveyance of property in the ancient Near East. Interestingly, secular-leaning theologians view this whole transaction as Abraham, now about 137 years of age, taking decisive action to lay future claim to possession of the land. But I agree with Alter's citing of Meyer Sternberg, an Israeli biblical scholar, that this whole reading is indicative of the challenges inherent in Abraham's life of covenant, and that being sojourning in a land that is promised to him and having to buy property just to bury his wife. The covenant threatened by the proposed binding test of Isaac and the nomadic and sojourning life that Abraham had to endure despite the great promises inherent in the covenant. In other words, covenant life ain't easy. Speaking of covenant, some Hebrew scholars view the official transfer of the land here from Ephron to Abraham as a covenant. In other words, the transfer of the cave and the field from Ephron to Abraham is memorialized by way of a covenant between Abraham and the children of Heth, or Heath. The term indicating this transaction was that of a covenant between the children of Heth and Abraham is the English term passed over. How does covenant come into a real estate transaction, you might ask? Well, the land was believed to be under the ownership of the children of Heth, or Heath. And the children of Heth agreed, that is, covenant with Abraham, possession of the land. They covenanted the possession of the land to Abraham. Interestingly, this parcel of land and the cave remain as one of the 3 hotly contested pieces of real estate in the land of Israel, and 3 of which were purchased by a patriarch. The most hotly contested, they were purchased with money. The one, this being this cave, the cave of Machpelah, and attached field, purchased by Abraham for 400 silver shekels. The second most contested area in the land is the alleged Temple Mount site, which records show was purchased by King David from Ornan for 600 shekels of gold. And that's recorded in 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 25. And then lastly, Joseph's tomb, purchased by Jacob, or Yaakov, at Shechem for 400 pieces of silver. And this is documented in Bereshit 33:19, Genesis chapter 33, verse 19. The other thing I'd like to point out to you here is an obscure mention in the book of Jubilees that Abraham's interaction with the Hittites over the acquisition of the burial plot was another test. A test. Recall back from last reading, we talked a lot about Abraham being tested of Yah, and by extension, us being tested of Yah. Well, in the book of Jubilees, there is this talk, this emphasis of this this interaction with Ephron and the Hittites as being a test put forth to Abraham by the court of heaven, another test. And this test was meant to determine how Abraham would handle his this somber situation. And of course, the writer of Jubilees affirms that Abraham did indeed pass the test, showing that he was patient with the Hittites, such that Abraham patiently conversed with the children of Heth or Heath. And the text describes this character trait of Abraham as a, quote, patience of spirit, end quote. And so in his passing this test, the text denotes that Yah granted Abraham grace before the inhabitants of the land, and that somehow the sale of the burial plot for 400 silver shekels was somehow a good deal. Now, let's start winding up here, because we've been going on for a long time, like I do every week. Anyway, this is our thoughts and reflections on the practical messianic halakha of this reading. Many rabbinic commentators and commentaries, for that matter, on this Torah reading, they focus on the burial aspect of our story. I touched upon this briefly earlier in our discussion. The burial aspect of this story. And as many of you know, I reference Messianic teacher and author and commentator Tim Hegg of Torah Resources quite often in my discussions. I respect Mr. Hegg for his balanced and his in-depth exposition of Yah's word, and he does so from a Messianic perspective. And I've referenced him, and I've studied his works and his writings for a few years now. But as it relates to our reading here today, Hegg's contention was that this reading was primarily about the Hebrew practice of burying one's dead, about the efficacy and the responsibility of Messianics to bury their dead as opposed to cremating them. And Hegg was not the only commentator I came across in my preparations for this week's reading who felt this reading was mainly about burial or burial over cremation. In fact, the title for this reading given by most rabbinic sources, including Hegg's commentary on this passage, was, quote, the death and burial of Sarah, end quote. And so I was surprised to see, given the other spiritual takeaways and lessons that could be learned from this reading, that so much emphasis was being placed on the practice of burying one's dead. And this contrasting of the practice of burying versus cremation. And some sources went so far as to stipulate that Yah commanded his people to bury their dead as opposed to cremating them, that it's a mitzvah, that it's a Torah commandment. But back to Hegg for a moment. Hegg, in his commentary, strongly advocates burial for Yah's people based in part on this week's reading. And he contends that burying is the only way to preserve the image of Elohim that resides in every human at death. And he cites Psalm chapter 39, verse 14 as a support passage. And he further contends that when one's body is cremated, that image of Yah that humans are naturally endowed with is disrespected and lost to some extent. Look, I get that maybe burying a loved one is preferable to cremating them. I absolutely do. I personally don't care for cremation myself. But from a practical standpoint, ideology aside, we must recognize that when humans die and their bodies are put in the ground, or in this respect, in a cave, unless those bodies undergo extensive preservation procedures like the Egyptians and even in some of our advanced embalming techniques today, well, those bodies, they decompose, and the elements that make up the human body, it returns to earth from which it came. And when you think about it, there are no remains to be had for any of our biblical patriarchs. As revered and as loved as they may be to us, every one of their bodies, with possibly the exception of Enoch and Elijah, every one of their bodies which were buried, decomposed, and returned to the dust of the earth. Nothing of them whatsoever remains to this day. Now, it seems to me to completely disavow cremation as a means of responsibly taking care of a loved one's remains, because all the patriarchs were buried and they weren't cremated, and that cremation erases or damages the image of Yah in man. It certainly ignores what happens to the body when it is buried. And such sentiments add to the sense of great loss that one may have at the death of a loved one. The elements of guilt and stress, especially when there is no money to bury a loved one these days. To insist that cremation somehow compromises the image of Yah that humans have been endowed with suggests to me that there is a great misunderstanding as to what Scripture means by man being made in the image of Yah. You know, I did a post entitled Made in the Image of God, made in the image of God, not Yah, made in the image of God, Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through chapter 2, verse 3, where I go into detail what it means to have been made in Yah's image. And if you've not had the opportunity to read or listen to that post, well, click the hyperlink in this discussion's transcript to be taken there. But the point I'm trying to make here is that being made in Yah's image has more to do with possessing Yah's character traits, such as a will that acts, the ability to reason and think and create, the capacity to love and to interact and converse and communicate, etc., then it means more. That's more of what the image of Yah is than the physical form of the human body. We can't get caught up in man's human form being the image of Yah. Look at what people do to their bodies. Is that the image of Yah? Yeah, they decimate it, if that is the focus, but it's not entirely. I'm not saying the physical form of the human body is not, or is not tied to the image of Yah. I'm just saying it's not the main thing. Look, I am by no means advocating, or I'm no means promoting cremation for the people of Yah. As I just said, I don't care at all for cremation. However, what I am saying is that burdening Yah's people with guilt and stress during their hour of grief is unloving and uncaring. Not everyone can afford to bury their loved ones these days. I remember growing up in the Black community in Baltimore in the 1960s. The vast majority of folks in that community were poor, or they had very little in terms of finances. And remember the tremendous stress, and I remember the tremendous stresses and strain my family members endured when a family member passed away, and they had to come up with funds to bury them. You see, cremation was not something that was done in that community in those days, but those family members had to put themselves in financial woes to bury their loved ones. Some had to go into debt for great amounts of time in order to bury their loved one. And still others had to beg and pass the hat around to family members to either lend or give them the money to bury. I remember my mother having to scrape up large sums of money to bury each of my uncles and aunts, and I think there were 8 of them, because their respective family members did not have money to bury them. This was over the course of many years. I remember this. Yes, the Hebrew faith traditionally buries their dead. But what is a faithful family to do if their loved one dies and they lack the funds to bury them? Cremation, as distasteful as it may seem to most, tends to be significantly more affordable, especially in this day and age, than burial. And furthermore, there is no mitzvah that prohibits cremation. Despite the cultural example of burial being the traditional practices of our ancient cousins, but we must also bear in mind that the burying of loved ones was not exclusive to the Hebrew community. or to the Hebrew faith. We see very clearly laid out here before us that the Hittites, and no doubt the other surrounding cultures and people, well, they buried their dead in caves. So burial was not a custom and traditional practice exclusive to Hebrews, exclusive to the Jews. Burial was a custom and traditional practice of most ancient Near East peoples, not just to the Hebrews. So to me, the takeaway or the practical halakha to be had here in our reading more so is the following. One, and I'm done with the issue of burial versus cremation. I just wanted to make that known that I disagree with commentators such as Tim Haig and some of the rabbinic commentators who make this reading solely about burial over cremation. I don't know why that is the case. And some of you may agree with them, and that's okay. We don't need to part company because of that. It's just my thoughts and reflections on this issue. And you're certainly entitled to your position and perspective on this issue. I just wanted to share mine. And we can just leave it at that. You either agree with me or you don't. That's fine. And like my friend says, I'm not mad at you if you disagree. But the takeaways are for me. One, Abraham dearly loved Sarah. And we see his love clearly displayed when she dies and she passes away. That is clearly seen. It is a reminder that we husbands must love our wives to such an extent that she is as an indispensable part of our very being. And the second is that this world is not our home. Now, the writer of Hebrews brilliantly highlights this reality of this world is not our home in chapter 13, verses 14 through 17. And the New American Standard reads, for here being this world, this nation, this state, this city in which we dwell, we do not have a lasting city, but we are seeking the city which is to come. Verse 15. Through him being Yahushua, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to Jehovah. That is the fruit of our lips that give thanks to his name. Verse 16. And do not neglect doing good and sharing, for with such sacrifices Yah is pleased. Verse 17. Obey your leaders and submit to them. Our leaders being those Yah has placed over us as an assembly of messianic believers in Messiah. For they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. Let them do this with joy and not with grief, for this would be unprofitable for you. Master commanded us, seek first his, Jehovah's kingdom, as well as his righteousness in Matthew chapter 6, verse 33. In giving us this most important directive, Master was by default supporting the contention that this world is not our home. We, Yah's elect, are tasked with promoting and looking forward to the kingdom of Yah. The kingdom of Yah is our true home, despite the fact that we must work the fields of this mundane world, the fact that we live and walk in covenant with our Elohim, the fact that we love Yah and one another until our Master returns for us. Beloved, we are not called to be patriots. We're not called to be social justice workers or warriors or whatever in this world. We are not called to involve ourselves in many of the affairs of this world. We are to focus on the affairs of the kingdom. Although we are children of promise or children of covenant, like Abraham, who scripture suggests was the only individual on the planet in covenant with him at that time, in covenant with Jehovah, we must recognize that until Yah fulfills the whole of the covenant and its related and attached promises, we must, one, realize that we are sojourners in this world, and as this world in its present state is not our home. And two, we are from time to time forced to deal with the peoples of this world, and we must learn to deal with them in accordance with kingdom principles, shrewdly, faithfully, such that the world sees Yah in us. Wow, I went really long today, and I don't, as I always say, I don't make apologies. Father gave me so much content, and I didn't cut any of the content this go around. I kept it all in place, which means this is why it's so long. But I want to thank you if you have stayed with me all the way through to the end. And I pray that you were blessed with this teaching, the content of this teaching, as much as I was blessed in prayer, preparing it and putting it together. And so, as always, not to belabor this session any longer, because we've gone so long, I want to bid you be most blessed, fellow saints in training. And until next time, take care.